السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نحمده ونصلي على رسول الكريم. اللهم انشر علينا رحمتك وانزل علينا حكمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. So we have the ambitious agenda today to cover 150 years of Islamic history, and they also happen to be like one of the core 150 years in which a lot of our intellectual history takes place. So we're going to jump right in. I think this is probably the most important session. The reason I say that is not because learning about the Khulafa is not important. That is important. But this session is going to give you an appreciation for the richness of the Islamic civilization and heritage and the depth of our usul, the Islamic sciences. So for that reason, I would encourage everybody, if you want to listen to it a second time, it might be beneficial because we're going to move fast, but it's very, very important information. Now, I have a quote here that references the use of the Dark Ages. So in Europe, that's typically from the year 700 to 1000, out of the medieval period, which is talked about as the Dark Ages. And that impression is a very Eurocentric definition because, as Bertrand Russell mentions, from India to Spain, the brilliant civilization of Islam flourished. What was lost to Christendom at this time was not lost to civilization, but quite the contrary. So this is what we term the Islamic Golden Age. Today we're talking about really that tail end of that Islamic Golden Age, which is not golden in the sense that it's without turmoil, but it's golden in the sense of its results. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about the compilation of hadith. This is very important. In fact, tomorrow's khutbah is about this subject, about the importance of hadith. We live in a time in which people are continuing to challenge the importance and the significance of hadith because people feel that they can manipulate this is my version, that they feel they can manipulate the Quran more easily because the Quran leaves a lot of matters open to interpretation. And so when you're stuck with hadith, it seems to impose some rigidity, or there are some solitary reports that people are very skeptical of, and as a result of that, they throw out the baby and the bathwater and they say, well, we are not going to accept hadith, or we're going to give it the secondary status after the Quran. But have you ever heard of any Muslim call themselves Qur'ani Muslim, right? You know, we belong to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people that follow the Sunnah and the Jama'ah. That means the multitude, the congregation of Muslims, right? So we are with the Jama'ah. And so there's a reason that we are named after the secondary source, the Quran, because somebody might say, well, why not the first one? Why don't we call ourselves Quranic Muslims, right? And the reason for that is because the Quran itself references the Sunnah, that in order to implement and to follow the orders of the Quran, you have to really follow the Sunnah. So that's a sneak peek into tomorrow's subject, inshallah. Then we're going to talk about the development of the madhahib. This needs its own class, which at some point, inshallah, we're going to do, but this will be a little bit of a crash course into that. We'll talk a little bit about medicine and mental health. We'll delve into a little bit detail there. And we're going to talk about the Mu'tazila movement, and in particular, the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, right? So al-Amin and al-Ma'mun, and his 18-year policy of the Mihna, right? Now, the Mihna is very famous in Islamic history, especially because of the ordeal of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. So we're just going to touch upon that, talk a little bit about Aqeedah. That's another subject that I hope we're going to pick up in the future. Maybe we'll have a special session to talk about Islamic belief systems as part of the essentials of faith. So we're not going to actually delve into the Aqeedah issues, but we're going to talk about how the schools of Aqeedah developed and what are the acceptable limits of the viewpoints, and what are the ending of those acceptable viewpoints. Then we'll talk a little bit about Turkey, India, and West Africa, right? So last time we talked a little bit about India, but really today's Pakistan, and then we talked about East Africa. So today we're going to talk a little bit about West Africa as well, inshallah. So today we're talking about the development of Islamic sciences and usul. Now before we go, this is a copy of Al-Bukhari, right? Which actually you can order like a facsimile type print of one of the early prints, handwritten prints of Al-Bukhari. But before we go any further, I want to quiz you guys. And here's my question. When did fiqh, so fiqh means Islamic jurisprudence. Fiqh is not just law. Fiqh is everything that you do as a Muslim. When did fiqh begin? When did fiqh start? Since we're talking about Islamic history. Let me hear some answers. No, fiqh itself as a thing, like when did people need to practice fiqh, practice jurisprudence? In the time of Umar, okay. So, but then why not Abu Bakr? Why are you picking on Abu Bakr? Why skip him? So it could be Hazrat Umar radiallahu anh because he's implementing a lot of new situations. The place expands. Are there any who think that it's later than that? Any who think that it's earlier? Earlier, so probably earlier than that. So how much earlier? Usul is, I mean, we didn't get to the usul yet. We're just talking about fiqh. Fiqh is what you have to do as a Muslim. During the time of the Prophet, that is correct. When precisely was the very first moment when you had to start living as a Muslim? When he was in Mecca, we're getting closer, yeah. When precisely when he was in Mecca? Well, we said, so it's in Mecca, but when in Mecca? The moment that Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ and he became a messenger, fiqh began. So Islamic law began the moment of, it coincides with the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, usul al-fiqh is the science of jurisprudence. That is how we synthesize the sources and we create rulings. Even if we're not doing ijtihad, even understanding that is its own kind of science. Oh, I'm getting answers in the chat. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay, with the first, subhanAllah, I'm so sorry. Yes, there was the first answer was there in the chat. With the first revelation, that's correct. But what about usul al-fiqh? When did the science begin? This is a harder one. Abu Bakr, when with Abu Bakr? Because I told you that fiqh began the moment that Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ. So when did the science of fiqh begin? The moment of, well, the ta'un happened much later. That plague happened in the time of Umar, in which he visited Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah in Syria. So then we're skipping. But we said it's Abu Bakr, but when in the time of Abu Bakr? Because remember we said it was the moment that Jibreel came. So when did the science begin? Well, okay, well, conceptually, why is it that we didn't need the science during the life of the Prophet ﷺ? Allah, exactly. Because the Prophet, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ, the Prophet ﷺ did not synthesize rulings. His speech is the law. What he says is revelation, right? Even though it's not the words of revelation, it comes with the meaning and the import of the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ did not practice usul al-fiqh because his pronouncements are fiqh. And people just needed to follow what he said. So when did the science of figuring it out, when did it need to begin? When he passed away. See? So now everybody's with us? So the moment the Prophet ﷺ disappears, which is the moment of his passing, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then now we need to figure stuff out. And it happened in the case of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, when they were figuring out, what do we do? Who's going to be the Khalifa? Right? Remember, Umar was in a state of panic. Then Ali radiallahu anh was focused on the burial of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and Abu Bakr and the others. This is a point of contention among Sunnis and Shi'is, right? Because of what happened in Bani Saqifa in the garden, right? But Abu Bakr correctly, in our view, correctly prioritized selecting the Khalifa over burying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But of course, there are different versions about that. So this is usul, that's the science. So for the compilation of hadith, it really started when the Khawarij started fabricating hadith, when the Mu'tazila started to fabricate hadith, when Bani Umayyah started to fabricate hadith, when the Alid started to fabricate hadith. Which group fabricated hadith? This is a trick question. All of them. Everybody, you name it. If you cannot even begin to wrap your head around how many fabricated hadith there are. And this can be very upsetting. People who start to study Islam and they learn about the volume of fabricated hadith, they get overwhelmed. They're like, well, I don't want to deal with hadith anymore. And it makes them, kind of suspect every hadith that, oh, it could be fabricated. But the reality is that we have a very precise science. And so what happens is the science of ilmul rijal, right? Imam al-Bukhari, he compiles a huge encyclopedia. Ibn Hajar Asqalani compiles an even bigger encyclopedia, which is based on the biographies, based on the science of al-jarh wa ta'deel. What are the defects in the narrators and what are the good qualities? Is the person trustworthy or not? And so what we need in order to have a good hadith is that it has to be connected with a chain. It has to be a hadith that is musnad. What does musnad? Sanad means chain. So the hadith that is musnad means the hadith that is connected. But it could be weak. There could be somebody in there that's weak. But the first thing they figured out is, well, we don't know. And early on there's a problem, because before there were a lot of fabricated hadith, the tabi'een, the second generation, they said the Prophet ﷺ said, Hassan al-Basri says the Prophet, wait a minute, Hassan al-Basri is one of the most pious people. But he never met the Prophet ﷺ. Where is he getting it from? Where did Hassan al-Basri hear it from? Where did Ibrahim al-Nakhai hear it from? From one of the Sahaba. Do we know who? Do we know which one? No, because the hadith omits that name. Why is that not such a big deal? If you have a missing Sahabi, that's a hadith that's called mursal, right? In which the name of the Sahabi is not mentioned. Why is it a big deal? Like, we're in 2024. If I say, oh, I heard from somebody in the 1800s, say this hadith, and I give you the whole chain. Let's say it's from the golden chain. You know, there's a golden chain, the shortest chain to the Prophet ﷺ. And I narrate it, but this person in the 1800s to this person to that person, and I give you this beautiful golden chain. What's the problem? I'm in 2024. I am not 200 years old. Okay? So what does that mean? That means I heard it from somebody else. Do we know who that is? So this is a hadith that is munqati'. It's not somebody who's mentioned, but we don't, it's not a hadith majhul, where somebody's mentioned, but we don't know who it is. It is a hadith that's disconnected. It's a very weak hadith when that happens. Very weak. All right? But why is it that when the Sahabi is not mentioned, it's not such a big deal? Why is it? Because when I mentioned somebody from the 1800s, between the 1800s and 2024, there are people in there. The possibility is that those people could be, what type of people are they? They could be liars. Do we know whether they're liars or not? We don't know, because we don't even know their name. But when this name of the Sahabi is missing, why does that not cause us pause? Does it matter if it's Abdullah ibn Abbas or Abdullah ibn Umar or Ibn Mas'ud? It doesn't matter, because our belief is in the adalat of each and every Sahabi, that each and every Sahabi is trustworthy. So in the worst case scenario, the person has a bad memory, might mix up some words, some letters, they might get the order of the hadith wrong, but we know for sure the person is not a liar. So they start figuring this out. Imam Malik ibn Anas, he's located in Medina, and he learns from many of the great tabi'een, and he produces a book called Al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta means the path that is trodden on. And it's a very unique book. He combines the hadith and fiqh, which we defined earlier, the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, and the sayings of the tabi'een, and the sayings of the khulafa. And he also references the amal ahlil Medina, the practice of the people. Why do we need to talk about the practice of the people of Medina? We have the Quran, we have the Hadith. Why do we need to know that? What's Imam Malik's logic and reasoning? Why is that? Well, we have a Maliki here, so tell us. We have a lot of Malikis here. The Prophet ﷺ lived in Medina, okay. I mean, I live in Potomac. Do you guys all do what I do? Right? Well, of course, I'm not the Prophet ﷺ, but why would the Prophet ﷺ and these people being in the same city, how does that give us authenticity? Because an individual can do whatever they feel like, right? So why does this, how is this have dalala? How is this a proof? Forget about the thubut, whether it's definitive. How is that even a dalil? How is that a proof? Right, but if it's one person, it won't be a proof. I'm giving you guys some hints. You got a whole city of people. One person, just because they're in the same city doesn't mean that he's doing what the Prophet ﷺ did. But what's the implication when you have a whole city and they're all doing the same thing? It's well known. Exactly. Jazakallah. That because this is the only way that people in Medina have done. So I will give you a very famous example. Hopefully, with this class I'm trying not to step on any toes. But the Prophet ﷺ, according to my understanding, he never raised his hand in the janazah or the Salatul Eid. But a lot of people, they do that because Abdullah ibn Umar, one of the greatest companions, one of the greatest scholars of the Prophet ﷺ, he used to do so. But the other fuqaha, they said, we don't have any textual evidence for that. And in the Maliki school, for example, you have all these people in Medina, they're not raising their hand, right? So if you're in a city and you're the one guy in the giant Eid prayer of 5,000 and you start raising your hand, what's going to happen? Everybody's going to look at you funny. What are you doing? Why are you doing that? So because you have a collective of people, there's a level of conformity. So there's a confirmation in that in order to get everyone to practice the same way, it has an aspect of tawatur, right? Tawatur means multiple reports. So there's a report that's kind of implicit in the action. Even if they're not saying, I heard from the Prophet ﷺ, or I saw from the Prophet ﷺ, because it's intergenerational, that itself is a proof. The other Imams, they didn't agree with that. But Imam Malik has had a very deep impression on the compilation of hadith and in fiqh. Then you have the 6 books of hadith. Imam Muslim, he's in Nisapur. Then Ibn Majah, he's also Persian. At-Tirmidhi, he's Uzbek. Abu Dawood is from Sistan, which nowadays is in Afghanistan. And Nasa'i in Turkmenistan. What do we immediately notice in the 200 years after the Prophet ﷺ? Where is the action happening? East. And this is amazing that within 200 years, the masters of the Arabic language and the masters of hadith are located outside of the Middle East. Right? And in those days, they didn't consider the Middle East either. Right? This is Greater Persia and Khurasan. But Arabic was the lingua franca. Arabic was the language of intellectuals from Spain to Hungary to East Africa, all the way down to Multan. Arabic language was the language of all of the intellectuals. Then this is a very important topic about the madhab. We get this question all the time. People, they ask, why do we have to follow the madhabs? Why only 4? And to that I say, who told you there are only 4 madhabs? There are not only four madhabs. We have Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Shafi'i, right? And Imam Hanifa is, I think, the one that I missed. Who else do we have? Ja'fari. Ja'fari is a very early, the fiver Imams of the Shi'i school, right? Later it became, Ja'fari became more like the 12ers, right? Zaydi being from the five, right? So you have the Zaydi school, you have the Ja'fari school, these are both Shi'i. What else do you have from the Sunnis? You have the Zahiri school that was followed by Ibn Hazm, very common. Ibn Arabi was also a literalist, was also Zahiri. Imam Hanifa, yes, one of the four. What else? Imam al-Awza'i was very, very popular. Imam Layth from Egypt, who was a contemporary of Imam al-Shafi'i and widely respected and revered in Egypt. And the only reason that you don't find any followers of Imam Layth is because who came after him in Egypt that superseded him? Imam al-Shafi'i, right? So if you're a superstar and then there's an even bigger superstar, then everybody forgets about you. So that's what happened to Imam Layth. But he was an amazing man. And there's more and more and more. We could list, Imam al-Bukhari was a mujtahid, but he was very passionate as a Shafi'i. Some people say he's a Hanbali, but I think he's Shafi'i. And he advocated for those views. And so as a result of that, he didn't establish his own madhab. Abu Yusuf from the Hanafi school, Muhammad al-Shaybani from the Hanafi school, they could have established their own madhab, but they didn't. They stayed within that school of thought. So here are some of the differences. Imam Malik, you have the Amal Ahl Medina. They also talk about the urf as muhakkam, that the customs can have a legislative effect. Imam al-Shafi'i, he writes the book in which he talks about the khabar ahad, the single hadith narration. There was a big debate. Even among Ahlul Ra'i, the people of Kufa, especially the Hanafis, they said, no. We don't want to follow these single hadith, right? Because it is qata', it's dhanni thubut. It's speculative. We don't know, did the Prophet ﷺ really say it? And that was at a time in which the hadith science was not fully developed. And then later Imam al-Shafi'i, he writes this book and he defends that yes, we can rely on a single chain of narration to the Prophet ﷺ. And today, as a result of the effort of Imam al-Shafi'i, there is a consensus among the ummah, right? So even as a Hanafi, I still follow that view of Imam al-Shafi'i, that we do follow from a single chain of narration. Then you have Imam Ahmad, who the Salafis claim to follow. But as we'll discuss later, in my view, they're not actually following the school of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. His school is very simple, which is, you could say, the libertarian school, right? Because people, they have a tendency to say, oh, this is liberal and this is conservative. These terms are foreign. What he does is he relies on the hadith. He's ahlul hadith. So he rejects the istihsan, the maslaha, all of the logical arguments that the Hanafis and the people in Iraq are doing. And he said, no, let's stick to the basics. Let's not speculate. Then you also have Tafsir al-Tabari. Imam al-Tabari, he also produces Tarikh al-Tabari, which is a very detailed account of history. Then you have development of medicine. Ibn al-Haytham, he's the founder of optics. He combines physiology and physics and mathematics to understand the optic nerve and to also talk about the science of lenses and optics. Until now, the entire science of optometry, ophthalmology is due to Ibn al-Haytham. Ibn al-Nafis, he talks about pulmonary circulation of blood. He talks about the heart and the lungs and the connection between the two at a time in which that was very poorly understood. Ibn Sina, we didn't quite get to his time, but he synthesized the Greek theories, Aristotelian theories, and his own views. He produced a canon of medicine that was translated into dozens of languages, and it was found in every university, in every medical college in the world for hundreds of years. It was taught in Europe throughout the ancient period and throughout the Renaissance. So medicine really goes ahead in this period. Mental health also develops. We see in Islam the first time the development of hospitals. Remember how I talked about Muslims develop soap and how advanced we were in hygiene? Now we're developing clinics, Dar Ashifa, Maristan, Bimaristan, having hospitals that are filled with specialists, physiologists, surgeons, bone setters. They divide men and women. They have a special ward for psychologically ill. They establish endowments. The Mamalik, which we'll talk about next time, like the Qalawun in Cairo. If you go in those that went with us to the Egypt trip, we went to Shari' al-Mu'izz. Al-Mu'izz is one of the first, actually he is the first of the Mamalik, and he established on that street, you have the Qalawun. And in addition, you have traveling clinics, dispensaries. They establish, during the Abbasid time, this is pre-Obamacare, okay? No Obamacare. They establish a rule that no physician can refuse treatment. That you treat first and then you bill after, right? And we're still trying to figure that out over here, right? In the Abbasid time, they made a list of rules of medical ethics in which they developed the Hippocratic Oath, and they had a system of al-muhtasib, in which they would have an accountability board that would investigate the market, that would test scales, that would investigate consumer complaints, that would check out what physicians are doing, what pharmacies are doing. This is unknown in the world at the time. A level of government regulation that is still missing in the Middle East, right? That in fact, we were in some ways more developed in the year 900 than we are today. Intellectually, we were more developed. Actually, in the bottom, there's a picture. This is, I think, from Syria. This is a psychological ward. And we see that they have a design of having gardens, having walkways, so people wouldn't feel, because it was different. Like in Europe, those psychological wards were punitive. They felt that they were possessed, or that there was like a jinn, the person, even the word majnoon, right? The person needs an exorcism, right? Satan has touched them. But in Islam, it was based on rehabilitation. And so that's why they would create these beautiful gardens that were meant to rehabilitate the person. This is Professor Rani Awad. She is a professor from Stanford, and she's one of the founders of one of the organizations here in America, talking about the Islamic legacy of Muslim mental health. And she's highlighted, she's actually the person that has written many articles on Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Who else is from al-Balkh that's really famous? This is a hard question. There's a very famous poet. When people go through breakups, they read this guy. Maulana Rumi. He is also al-Balkhi. And al-Balkh is from today in Afghanistan. This is, I mean, I've met Afghans that I mentioned, do you guys know like how rich your history is? A lot of people don't know, right? This is a very rich area of many scholars and poets. But of course, if you read the books that we're referring to, they all say, and he was Persian. Because at that time, that was regarded as Persian. It was not regarded, like if you read it in Arabic, they would say, oh, he was Persian. And the same thing, when you talk about the Turkic Central Asia, everybody's Turkish. But then later on, you find out this one is Tajik, this one is Uzbek, this one is Oghuz tribe, and because it's all categorized one way. So he wrote this book, Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, right? And she has printed this in her journal article because she got a manuscript that she's holding there. I think this is from a library. I'm not sure where it is. It might be in Egypt. And that's the original manuscript of al-Balkhi's work. And she sees sections in which he treats and classifies OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and talks about phobia. And this is 1,000 years before Freud. Right? This is 1,000 years before Western psychology. And what's also interesting is that there are details in observation, identifying the symptoms, and also treating. The part that I find really fascinating is the focus on clinical depression. Why is that important? Because in our Muslim communities, when somebody says they're depressed, what does everybody say? Well, they could say you're crazy, but usually they say read Quran. They said, they say you're ungrateful. How can you be depressed? Didn't Allah give you this and you're comfortable and look at what's happening in Gaza? How can you be depressed? Right? Because sometimes we give the worst advice to each other, right? Sometimes the best thing you should say if you don't know what to say is nothing, right? But usually we say like read the Quran and just do dhikr and you'll feel better. But in early Islam, we see that they have a deep appreciation for clinical depression and what are the cognitive, how do you have to reprogram the brain? Today we would talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, for example. And also, what is the nexus between psychology and spirituality? How can dhikr, how can fikr, how can that assist in mental health? That's something that I think is missing in Western psychology. Now, of course, we have to talk a little bit about the politics. There is a downward spiral that is happening in the Abbasid court. After Al-Mansur, then he has this brilliant plan that he's going to have this succession. He writes in his will that he's going to have his two sons, Al-Amin is going to be the Khalifa first, and then the successor will be Al-Ma'mun, right? And he says that Al-Ma'mun is going to be the governor in Khurasan, and thinking that they're all going to live happily ever after. But in reality, that is a formula for a disaster. The rival courts, we talked about the Baramka last time. There are different supporters. We see in much of Islamic history that usually the wazir, the vizier, is the person that's holding the real power. We see this in some countries where you have like the prime minister and you have the president, and the president is just a figurehead and it's really the prime minister that has all the powers. So what happens is the Khurasani force that is led by Al-Ma'mun actually is victorious against the main Abbasid force in Baghdad. They lay a siege for over 1 year and the city falls. Al-Ma'mun, he rules from Merv, which is in Turkmenistan today. He makes this alliance with the Alids. There's a big rumor that he must be Shi'i, but in fact he's not Shi'i, he's just making an alliance in order to stay in power. And then he realized that this is not working, and he goes from Merv and he shifts back to Baghdad. Now once he's in Baghdad, he likes to dabble in everything. He gets involved in poetry, he gets involved in politics, he gets involved in religion. He invites all of the great scholars, philosophers, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, you name it, and he wants everybody to discuss Quran and Hadith. And this is weird. Muslims are not used to this. After the Rashidun Khulafa, remember the Umayyads, we said they didn't touch religion? They didn't even want to pretend that we're very pious. Because if you start telling people you're pious, then you're stuck with that. Then you have to keep being pious. So they're like, no, we're just regular people. But now Al-Ma'mun is dabbling into religion, and it has some very dangerous consequences. Al-Ma'mun adopts the Mu'tazila school of Wasil ibn Ati, and you can also say the Jahmi school. This is a school of rationalism. They believe that if a person engages in a major sin, then the person has no faith. That person is a disbeliever. They believe that God is all good, just, and wise, and therefore all evil must emanate from human beings. It's not possible that any evil can come from Allah. And most significantly, they believe that attributes are not co-eternal with God, right? We're going to explain that in just a moment. They believe that Allah's attributes are things that He created, not things that pertain to His essence of who He is. So for example, since Allah makes speech, since Allah speaks, we know that, then it means that Allah has to precede speech. So you can't have speech and Allah at the same time. So therefore they come to the conclusion, where did the speech come from? It was created. And you guys have been listening to Dr. Tariq for many years, and every time he mentions the Quran is the uncreated speech of Allah, right? I've only been here for 2 years. I've heard him say it 100 times, right? We're going to take a little diversion into Al-Jahid and get back to that. Al-Jahid is a black Arab from Banu Kinana. Now, this is just a pet peeve of mine. Every time from modern Muslims, especially in America, you get these posts in social media, and they're like, oh, Al-Jahid, he was African. And they did the same thing with Imam Adil al-Kalbani. He was the Imam of the Haram, and all on social media, they're like, oh, there was an African Imam of the Haram, and people post videos of him leading the Salah. He was the Imam of the Haram. For many years, he's one of the best reciters. His recitation is phenomenal. But this is absolutely false. We have to wrap our head that Arab is not a color, okay? There are many black Arab tribes that exist today. And so Al-Jahid is a black Arab, he's not African, and he's from the tribe of Banu Kinana, and he is, I think, the greatest prose writer in Islamic history. There are others that are really great, but I think Al-Jahid is the best. And he wrote this book called Kitab al-Hayawan, which I think we should highlight. It's a 7-part encyclopedia on animals. Now, for students of science, who does that remind you of? Who visited the Galapagos Islands and wrote about the animals that he observed? Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species. Has anybody read it? Yeah. It's a very interesting book. You know, I know Muslims, they have a big problem with evolution. Like, you can read the book and still believe that Allah created human beings, right? We don't need to be that allergic to discussing things. And I personally, I mean, I don't agree with evolution, but I think it's a very interesting theory to consider. And in here, he talks about the first theory of evolution, which is different from the conclusions of Darwin because it's evolution alongside creationism. That within species or within the same genus or from one species to another, that there is variation between animals, that's the result of evolution. So I would encourage Muslims, I don't think it's in English, but you know, if you're able to read it or examine it, it's really fascinating, especially for the scientists that are here. There's also Al-Mutanabbi, and Mutanabbi is one of the greatest poets. He's a little bit full of himself, right? وَالسَّيْفُ وَالرُّمْحُ وَالْقِرْطَاسُ وَالْقَلَمُ وَاللَّيْلُ وَالْبَيْدَاءُ you know, I mean, he talks about all of his victories, right? But his poetry is amazing. At-Tawhidi, As-Sistani. This is the height of the Arabic language that happens in the Abbasid times. Then we have the fourth fitna. Remember we talked about Al-Ma'mun, and he was a follower of the Mu'tazila school. He begins the Mihna. That means the Islamic Inquisition. Did you know we had our own Inquisition? There were 18 years of religious persecution in which all the dissenting scholars were imprisoned and even executed. What do you think most scholars did? He keeps insisting the Quran is created, the Quran is created. What would you do if you could, all you had to, either you could die or you could say the Quran is created? What would you do? Real talk. You would just say it, but also, I mean, isn't there a part of your mind that's like, is that a big deal? Is anybody else thinking that? I'm thinking that. It doesn't seem like such a big deal. Like, I believe in Allah, I believe in the prophets, I believe in the Quran, they don't deny the Quran, so whether it's created or not created, who cares, right? But for Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, it is a big deal. The vast majority of the scholars, they said, well, you know, what, it's created in this way, but it doesn't really, it's created lafzi. Once you say it, then it's created. So your lafz is created, but at the moment that Allah revealed the Quran, it wasn't created. So you can do a little bit of a dance there, right? In 833, Al-Ma'mun is succeeded by Al-Mu'tasim, and there's a whole bunch of other Abbasid leaders. Then finally, Al-Mutawakkil, all these transitions get bloody. The reason is now, who is influencing the Khalifa? We have the introduction of Al-Mawali. So the word Mawla, what does that mean in Arabic? The word Mawla Mawla has a lot of different meanings. Here it means like a non-Arab, like a client, right? So here the mawali can mean any non-Arab, but when we're talking about the Islamic Empire at this time, and we say somebody is a non-Arab, because you had Arabs, you had Persians, and then the mawali, where are they coming from? Now you have a new culture of the ghazi, of the Muslim warrior. These people did not speak any Arabic. Most of them didn't know how to read and write, but they acted as mercenaries, and they were extremely influential in Islamic history. And this is the rise of the Turkic people. These are the Turkic nomads, and even though there is no Islamic empire in Central Asia, they are entering into the Abbasid kingdom, and they are actually a form of shadow government. They're influencing the Abbasid Khalifas, and they're not interested in sitting on the throne. They're interested in yielding the real power from behind the scenes. Then when you go to Algeria and you go to Tunisia, then you have the Aghlabids, and actually they're Ismaili at the time, right? They found the state of Afriqiya, right, which just means Africa in Arabic, and they also followed the Mu'tazila. So now it's like 2 layers of complexity, right? And so you see on the west you have the Mu'tazila, on the east you have Mu'tazila. So it seems like the Islamic ideology and creed is under attack. And I'm going to show you a map in a moment in which you have the rise of the Samanid Emirate, the Buyid Emirate in Persia, the Fatimiyin, the Fatimid Caliphate that develops after Ibn Tulun in Egypt. So when you look at the map, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle. What happened to the caliphate? It went from one big country and now it's all a big mess. How did this fall apart so quickly? But before we look at the map, this is a quote from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who is known as Nasir al-Sunnah, the savior of the Sunnah. He said, I saw scholars that were with me sell their faith. So I said to myself, who am I? What am I? What am I going to say to Allah tomorrow when I stand in front of Him and He asks me, did you sell your deen like the others? So I looked at the whip and the sword and I chose them. But ultimately Imam Ahmad was too popular. They couldn't do anything to him. But there's a whole long story which we'll share one day in the ways in which he was severely tortured. Then there was an episode towards the end of the Abbasid Empire in which you have a rebellion, the Zenj rebellion. And these are Africans that came from the eastern, the southeast African coast. They call it Zenj, which means the Swahili coast. And these were partly slaves that came, but also freemen that came to work on the marshes of Iraq and to work on the salt marshes. So this is just to add to the instability. You have the Asabiyya. Ibn Khaldun, he talks about the social cohesion that happens when you have good leadership, when you have a singular mission. Then what ends up happening is after the society has cohesion, then you have incapable leaders, which is what happened with the Abbasid. Then they stop paying, they stop supporting scientists and artists and intellectuals. There's no patrons. Then the society becomes weaker because of that instability. Then you have rival factions. Everybody competes in order to be at the top. And then in the Abbasid case, they lost legitimacy because they were no longer the leaders of the Sunni world. That combination of being from the family of the Prophet ﷺ and adopting the Sunni Islam, which was this is what the vast majority of Muslims practice around the world, that combination was a winning formula. Once they adopted the Mu'tazila school and they lost that credibility, then things also started to fall apart. And this is the map that we talked about. So we have the Umayyi, Abdurrahman the first, the second, and the third, all brilliant leaders from the Umayyad Caliphate. Then later, they become weak. Then they're independent kingdoms. Then you have Al-Murabitun, Then you have Al-Muwahhidun, which are empires, emirates that are in North Africa that are in today Morocco. And they end up having to save the Muslims in Spain. Because even though we have this happy-go-lucky situation, the convivencia of different religions that are all together in Andalus, it comes crashing down because you have efforts for reconquista, that we need to reconquer the Muslim lands that have been taken away. So you have these small Christian kingdoms that are reacquiring that land. So they send in these garrisons to retake that area, but it's just a band-aid. It doesn't last forever. And then in Morocco, you have the Idrisid, Mawlay Idris, which is actually from Faz, and they rule for an extended period. Now in Cairo, remember we said in the west, you have from Algeria and from Tunisia, you have the rule of the Aghlabids. After the Fatimids take over, they're Ismaili, and they take over Cairo, they establish Al-Azhar University. In the top right, that's a picture of us at Al-Azhar University. That's from the year 970, if I'm not mistaken. No, 870. No, 970. So it's over 1,000 years. It's the oldest continuously operating university, but the second university in the world. And that was established by the Fatimiyin, by the Fatimid Caliphate. They take over Al-Hijaz, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, all of those areas. Then you have the Al-Qaramita, right, over there. They're a bunch of nutcases, right? We don't have time for it. They actually take over in Mecca and Medina. They kill a lot of people. They attack the Kaaba, and you won't believe what they did. Guess what they stole? They stole the black stone. And they had it for decades. And the Abbasids paid like an enormous sum because it was so embarrassing. Like, you are the caliph. How on earth did you let somebody steal the black stone, right? And so they had to pay that ransom, and that's how the black stone got returned. Because otherwise it might have disappeared, right? Then you have the Buyid Empire. That's the Qaramita, right? They're a kind of extreme Shiite. I don't want to say Shi'is because then people are going to be like, oh, that's what they do. But you know, there are many sects, and Shi'ism is not established firmly at this time, right? And so many of what you're seeing on the map are Ismaili Shias. You're seeing Zaydi, a sect. This is a sect of Zaydi, Fiver Shia. So it's not the Ithna Ashriya, the Ja'fari school that we see so often. The Buyids are there in Baghdad, and they are ruling under the figurehead of the Abbasid Khalifa. But in reality, they're in charge. Then you have the Samanids, who are up in Khurasan, and then and you have the Safarids, which we skipped, and then we have the Ghaznavids that we're going to talk on the east. Now, what is happening to the Abbasid Empire? Is it getting bigger or smaller? If we consider only the Buyid with the blue, not the blue, with the red and the green together, if we consider that, we kind of consider that Abbasid, even though they don't have real control, it is a quarter of what it used to be. They're getting squeezed from both sides. So this is what the scholars have called the Shi'i century. The irony of the Shi'i century is that the numbers of Shi'is around the world is actually very small, right? So the vast majority of people are just following regular Islam. In fact, I could say that they're Sunni, but most of these people, if you find them and you say, what kind of Islam do you follow, what are they going to say? They won't say Sunni, because the word Sunni was only developed after Shi'is developed. Then people are like, I'm not Shi'i, I'm Sunni. What did people say before? When they asked, what's your religion? They said, I'm Muslim. So all of these people, they're just going to say, I'm just a regular Islam, right? That's what they would say. Now we have to say a little bit about Aqidah. And because this is a time in which Islamic beliefs solidify. But I have a question for you guys. Why didn't the Sahaba go into these theoretical debates? That where is Allah's arsh? Where's His throne? What does istiwa mean? What, that He rested on that throne. What does that mean? What does Allah's hand, what does that mean? Does Allah's attributes, are they co-eternal with Him? Right? What is the nature of faith? Can it increase or decrease? Can, if you act as a sin, does that negate faith? Hopefully I haven't lost anybody with these difficult questions. Why do we find that the Prophet ﷺ didn't talk about that? Why did the Sahaba not discuss these issues? What do you guys think?
You give yourself answer because Prophet ﷺ didn't discuss about it.
But he could have. He could have said, well, he could have gotten into the theory, he could have gotten into the logic. Why not?
Because they didn't encounter groups that would challenge them.
There you go. Nobody was, their aqeedah was 100% crystal clear and understood intuitively. They didn't need to analyze it philosophically. So the aqeedah was set. It just was not explained in philosophical terms or logical terms. And then later Muslims, they had this debate. They said, well, Christians are saying this, Al-Farabi is saying this, right? The philosophers are saying this. How do we respond to Greek philosophy? And then the Muslims had to respond. And so some of them responded and some of them said, no, no, no. We're just going to take what it is. So this is, and some people went too far in responding, in describing Allah's attributes.
Could it also be that they were fighting for survival at that time?
Sure.
And then this was more sort of the disease of afterwards.
It could be that they were in survival mode. But the problem with that is that we believe مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي هَذَا الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ, that nothing in our religion has been left out. So when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, it means that every single piece has been completed. Every single thing on the checklist has to be crossed out. So Allah taking His life means that mission completed. So if the Prophet ﷺ didn't explain something, there is a reason for that, right? So there's certain things in Islam that are not well defined, and we believe that there has to be a reason. Like the famous example that I always bring up is that why don't we have a chapter in the Quran, called Chapter of the Beard? It sounds ridiculous, but why don't we have that? Or chapter, why don't we have Surah Al-Hijab to tell us, well, how many meters, and what shape, and how thick, and what color? Because then we don't want a religion like that. It's going to be suffocating for us to have to measure and go into all that detail. So instead, our religion allows us for certain latitude. Certain things are restricted and certain things are flexible. And that flexibility is not something that you have to add into Islam. That flexibility is built in. That's important to understand. But when it comes to the aqeedah, the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell us, because that level of analysis only causes a person to doubt unless you're refuting an attack. So the classical question is, what about tashbih or tanzih? So Salafis, a lot of them, they say we belong to the Athari school, in which we say, yes, Allah has a hand, yes, Allah, everything that Allah says, we believe in it literally. And they say we're following the Salaf, we're following Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. I'm going to share my personal view, and there are other views about this, which is that this is not what the Salafi teaching about Aqeedah, in particular the teaching of Ibn Taymiyyah, is not actually what the Salaf believed. The Salaf followed the principle of tanzih. Tanzih, what does tanzih mean? Tanzih. They're not doing tashbih. Tashbih is to say, oh, it's like this, it's like that. So they're doing the opposite. Not literal, right? Because that would mean like something zahir, right? Tanzih, nazaha an, right? How would you define tanzih?
I don't know the English. Like bila kayf, basically.
Bila kayf. So without trying to explain the how. So there are certain things that you leave off, that Allah said it, we believe in it, and we're not going to explain it. And that's different from saying that it means what it means literally. Everybody with me? So when Allah says, Yadullah fawqa aydihim, that Allah's hand is above their hand. So if we follow tanzih, what does that mean? It means we don't know. Allah said that His hand is over their hand. We leave it alone. We believe in it. We believe in all of it. But if you follow a literal translation, then it's going to mean Allah has a hand. Anthropomorphism. But they would defend it, they would say, bila kayf. So they take the anthropomorphism and then they erase it by saying, but we won't say anything about the hand. And so for the vast majority of Muslims, they would say, no, the aqidah of Salafis is incorrect. But incorrect does not mean invalid. Their aqidah is still within the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, what people today call the Athari school. But I personally am not convinced that the modern Salafis are following the Athari school, because for me the Athari school is tanzih. Tanzih means we don't need to get into this. And I'm cool with that. If somebody says we're not going to get into this, that's even better. Why do you need to get into that? Allah said all of these in the Quran, just stick to laysa kamithlihi shay. That there is nothing, Allah has no likeness onto anything else. But when it came to debating others, there is a force to be reckoned with that emerges. That is Abu al-Hasan. I wrote Ash-Shadhili, that's a typo. I meant Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, because they had the same first name, so I got confused. Muscle memory. And he is an ex-Mu'tazila. You know when you leave something, then you know the ins and outs of it. And he refutes it. He sees this dream that he needs to protect the Sunnah. The Mu'tazila, they said that Allah is muttasif with His sifat. If He has an attribute, then the attribute describes Allah, but it doesn't tell you who He is. So for example, Allah is as-Sami'. As-Sami' means He's all hearing. So they believe that His hearing is separate from Him, right? It's separate. But the correct opinion is that it is that. There are some sifat that pertain to Allah's being and essence of who He is. And so he refuted that and clarified the confusion about Allah in a way that perfectly aligns with the Quran and Sunnah. And I'm praising Imam al-Ash'ari, even though I'm not Ash'ari myself, because he's the one that really brought everybody together. He talked about the uncreated Quran, refutes about the pool of Kawthar, about the Shafa'ah for li-ahl al-kabair, for the people that are sinful. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, he, as I mentioned, he refutes it, but without going into the details. Abu Musa al-Maturidi is from Samarkand. And many people, they say, well, I'm Hanafi, right? If you're Hanafi, then your aqidah, your belief system is that of al-Maturidi. For me, al-Maturidi and Ash'ari are the same. 95% of Muslims all believe in exactly the same thing. Well, maybe 90% to be more accurate, right? And at the same time, the attacks are still continuing. So you have the beginnings of al-Kalam, right? This is the school of theology. And this is what Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who we're going to talk about very soon, he builds on that foundation. Islam is spread by thought and exploration. Very briefly, some cultural things. In East Africa, conversion is very slow. It tends to be coastal. Because the main tribes, they don't convert to Islam. Zanzibar becomes almost all Muslim. Somalia also, a very high percentage of Muslim. And this is because of trade. There is never an army that enters into East Africa, right? And the same in West Africa. There is no army that comes and invades. The Bantu, they're from West Africa. They migrate south. They move east. This is one of the main ethnic groups in Africa, right? And there are many, many tribes that come from the Bantu people. And they are engaged in trade with ivory, sandalwood, ebony, gold. The gold comes from mostly Mozambique. And later the slave trade expands, which we're going to talk about. In West Africa, you have the Fulani people. one of the other major ethnic groups. Today, 98% of Fulanis are Muslim, which is an incredible number. There are not 98% Muslims in Saudi Arabia, right? So it's a very, very high percentage. They embrace Islam very early on, and they are one of the strongest in Islamic history. Many, many great scholars that we're going to talk about, they come from the Fulani people. They're nomadic people, and they spread, they go to the Sahel, the grasslands, the sub-Saharan Africa. So if you look in a map of Muslim populations, you see a band of Muslims right underneath the Sahara. These are the people that we're talking about. And the Ghana Empire also, many of them become Muslim. The empire exists before Islam, and many of the leaders become Muslim, and we see that Islam spreads in Ghana as well. Quickly, we need to talk about India because of what's happening with the Babri Masjid. We're going to get to that in the future sessions. But a lot of the complaints of Hindus in India have to do with some of the conquests that we're talking about. The Ghaznavid Empire is centered in Ghazni, which is today in Afghanistan. That time was named Khurasan. And they enter into North India. But when they enter into North India, remember Muhammad bin Qasim, what did he do with the Hindu temples when he entered into Sindh? No. No, he preserved each and every one of them. And all of the Hindus had equal rights. But when the Ghaznavid Empire entered into North India, so they enter into the state of UP, right, which is the biggest state in India, right, in terms of population. It's Muslim minority, but in total, the Muslim population is huge, right? So they enter into Mathura and they destroy many of the historic temples that are there. They enter into Gujarat. They destroy, again, one of the main temples that are there. And this happens by Mahmud Ghazni. He extracts a lot of money from India. It's reported that there were 20,000 dinar, gold coins, that were removed from the temple and from the surrounding area. And then Lahore becomes, in Punjab, and today in Pakistan, becomes one of the main capitals. So this is part of our history that we have to grapple with, that there are some episodes that are very positive, and there are some aspects that are negative. You have Al-Biruni, who is a physicist, mathematician, linguist, and look at all the languages that he knows. He is a little bit critical of that history and documents it, which is another thing. How do Hindus know about these atrocities taking place? Who's documenting this? It's mostly Muslims. Most of the historians that are critical and writing against the leaders destroying Hindu temples are also Muslims. So the Muslim society does not agree on this. He writes a whole book on the study of Hinduism. And so interfaith study enters into that. Al-Biruni is known above all because he measured the radius and the circumference of the earth, which is with great accuracy. Almost, it was the most accurate number for hundreds of years. He talked about the moon stages, which we're seeing, and he also talked about the many uses of the astrolabe. We'll leave off with a couple of pictures. This is a photo from Ahmad ibn Tulun Masjid from the Tulunids. He was from Samarra, from Iraq, so he built a masjid in the same design. And to the right, you see the stalactite formation that the Mamalik were very famous for. I think this one is from Persia, but I really enjoy the one that's in Egypt. We visited the Sultan Hassan Masjid, and they have one of the most beautiful formations. I also want to remind you that we have an event on Saturday. We have a wonderful public speaker. She's very talented. So I want to encourage, especially the women in our community, the young people in our community. In fact, all of us can really benefit from developing our public speaking skills. So please register for that. This is a registration event. That's at 5:30 on Saturday, inshallah. We can take just a couple brief questions. I have the Zoom open as well. Who'd like to begin? There are no questions so far in the chat, so please let's get right at it. Yes, go ahead.
my own personal readings, if I'm remembering
Mhm.
correctly, he mentions that in Hinduism, from his analysis, the priestly Brahmin classes, he classified them as very close in monotheism, but the
Yes.
laity was more inclined.
So
towards
Al-Biruni, he talks
monotheism.
about the Brahmin being closer to monotheism and that the masses, I mean, but isn't that true? I mean, that is the case. I'm not an expert in Hinduism, but this is we've talked about it, that if you study the Hindu texts, that in reality, these deities are meant as intermediaries. And they do have a concept of God as the creator, right? Yes. And but that's not known among the masses. So he does document that, and he does mention that. But that's that's the Muslim impression. You know, we're also, as Muslims, you know, when you have a confirmation bias. So you know, there's a common saying that if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So as Muslims, we're like, oh, that's just like Islam. That's just like Islam. So when we study other religions, sometimes, you know, we have this tendency to find monotheism within it. I don't view Hinduism as a monotheistic faith, personally. But I do believe that they firmly believe in God. And so they believe in God, and they also have a belief in other deities. And this is mentioned in the Quran, that if you ask them, who do you believe in? They will say, we believe in God. Well, then why is it that you worship these aliha? Why do you worship those other deities? So both can be true. Any others? Shirk, yeah, so the shirk is not in the creation. They believe the shirk is in the ubudiyah, is in the worship, right? So they believe that that these deities are worthy of being worshipped, which means that they believe that God's divinity has been split, that He has intermediaries. And we see that in Surah Al-Ikhlas, that, you know, all of our kids in the Sunday school, they all remember, وَلَمْ يَكُلْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ, that He has no partner, right? لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ, right? So our tawheed is encapsulated within that, that nobody shares in that. And this is the concern in the Muslim world, is that some people, because there's veneration of awliya and saints and the pious, so people, out of an overabundance, I think overabundance of concern for shirk, they said, no, 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 you are doing shirk because of this veneration. And I think that the veneration itself does not constitute shirk. But if a person believes that divinity is ascribed to anyone other than Allah, so for example, if His power, if His knowledge, right, or any of those attributes that are exclusively His are believed to be shared with something that is created or an imaginary deity, then yes, that constitutes shirk. So according to that definition, Hinduism, as is practiced by the vast majority of people, would constitute shirk. But I also believe that there must be Hindus out there that believe that no, it's only God that has power, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's going to judge each person. But if somebody worships idols other than Allah, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَغْفِرُ أَن يُشْرَكَ بِهِ شَيْئًا. So that is not forgivable. Yeah. And there's another thing, I mean, the whole controversy of the Babri Masjid that was there for 500 years, they said, well, this is the birth site of Ram. Well, if Ram was born there, then, I mean, how was the world operating before Ram? I mean, if he was born. You know, and a lot of these temples, they say these are the birth sites. You know, a lot of the masajid, they're claiming that these are birth sites of some of their deities. So the idea that a deity can be born, you know, right off the bat is something that would be objectionable, you know, for Muslims, alongside the fact that there are deities being worshipped. Go ahead.
The issue of the hadith. Oh, thank you so much. Especially the concept of a missing link in the sanad.
Yeah.
I don't understand your explanation there. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit more. Like you were saying that if there is a missing link in the sanad in later times, we could just have a person who just made up the sanad and there are mistakes in the actual hadith transmission.
Right.
But you were saying that if it was a Sahaba that it was just referenced some random Sahaba, but then how do we know that that's not made up too? I don't.
Sure. So I'll clarify that. So the hadith mursal is when the name of the Sahabi that the Tabi'i got it from is omitted. So the Tabi'i heard it from a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, but the name is not mentioned. And it's very common because in the early generations, they weren't checking hadith the way that we did 200 years later. And so they said, oh, the Prophet ﷺ said, but they don't mention who they got it from. So that is regarded, according to the vast majority of Muslims, as a pretty strong hadith, even though it's within the categories of weak. And so sometimes people you'll see, they'll come to us as the Imam, me or Dr. Tariq, and say, you quoted a weak hadith. And that's why people need to trust whoever the Imam or the scholar is, that we're using our judgment based on what the matter is. There will be scenarios in which we might use weak hadith. For example, in the Shifa that Dr. Tariq is teaching on Fridays, some of those hadith are weak. But the reason that they're being narrated is because one hadith is supporting each other, or the meaning might have tawatur. So the individual chain might be pretty weak, but because there are a multiplicity of stories that even though the wording is different, the meaning shows that the event happened. And so even though it's a weak hadith, it's elevated. So that's how you have like a hadith that's, marfu' means that it's connected to the Prophet ﷺ because of that.
And when you were saying that we sort of implicitly accept the honesty of a lot of these people, is that the tabi'in?
Only for the Sahaba.
Only for the Sahaba.
Only for the Sahaba. Even for the Tabi'in, even though that's a very pious generation, because we can't say definitively that every Tabi'i is honest, we need to investigate the thiqah, the integrity of the Tabi'i that's narrating. But if there's a Sahabi's name, that's the only case in which we may let it go. Because regardless of who it is, it's still not going to disqualify that hadith from being authentic.
You're probably going to talk about this in the khutbah tomorrow, but I think it's important to expand on the concept of da'if hadith, because there's a perception that some people have that da'if means that, oh, the Prophet ﷺ probably didn't say.
I'm not going to talk about this, so I'll answer it. Da'if means it's a weak hadith.
Right.
And there are over 200 classifications for weak hadith. Most people don't even know the names. And mawdu' is only one classification. Fabricated is only one classification. So if we were to eliminate all the weak hadith, in fact, we're eliminating the vast majority of the hadith in Islam. So it's impossible. Some people have this idea that, well, I only want to hear authentic hadith. But we can't do that because the criteria for being authentic hadith is so stringent and so difficult, which is what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, about how the early generations painstakingly labored in order to produce chains of narrations that we know with virtual certainty were said or done by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that itself is one of the great intellectual accomplishments in human civilization, human history. All right. I think that's good for a day. Today was the heaviest out of the series, inshallah, but very important for our belief system and understanding of the fiqh, the law, the hadith, and the Quran. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in knowledge and give us the knowledge that is beneficial to us, show us the truth and allow us to follow it, and show us the falsehood and allow us to avoid it. We ask Allah to alleviate the suffering of our brothers and sisters in every corner of the world, in Gaza, in Palestine, in Myanmar, in China, in Kashmir, and in Sudan, and in all of the places in which they're suffering. Protect the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.